Hello, and welcome to the latest episode in our series on law in time of crisis. I am pleased to be joined today by Professor Stephen Dean, who shares with me the questionable judgment of having once upon a time agreed to serve as Vice Dean here at Brooklyn Law School. But fortunately, he, like myself, survived that position and is now thriving. He remains a member of our faculty and is currently on leave serving as director of the graduate tax program at NYU, but we are looking forward to welcoming him back in the upcoming academic year. Professor Dean is here to talk to us about a very timely and topical issue. So during this series, we've been talking about a number of crises, starting with the global pandemic, ranging to economic issues, social unrest, racial unrest. Today, we are going to range a little more broadly, quite literally, to the international domain and to international tax. So perhaps you can tell us why international tax is an issue in the news and why France and Amazon are not happy with each other.
So thank you, Dean Cahill. Thank you for having me on. I'm excited to be here today and excited to be coming back to Brooklyn next academic year. So the days we're living through are interesting in a lot of different respects and a lot of different dimensions. And one thing we know about crises, and we have several now, is they tend to be very expensive. So crises are expensive in all different sorts of ways. On the tax front, they're expensive because people aren't earning as much income, they're not buying as much stuff, so governments are collecting less revenue, but governments are also spending a lot more. So when they're taking in less and spending more, people get understandably nervous, and they should be. And this has had a pretty strange, or at least unexpected effect on the international tax world. For the last decade or two, the international tax world has been trying to grapple with, and this sounds a little bit dated, but it is, the rise of the internet. The way international transactions and global multinationals are taxed doesn't work very well, right? So it hasn't worked very well for at least 2 decades, probably before that. If you look back at some of Kennedy's speeches in the 60s, he was talking about the same sort of problems we've been dealing with since the financial crisis of global companies being able to avoid tax by engaging in offshore tax planning. And you think it was a problem for Kennedy, we'd have figured it out by now, but we never have quite figured it out. The problem that really came to a head with Amazon and the other digital giants and France was a function of that problem. There are really profitable global companies, the global giants, Amazon, Facebook, Google being the sort of poster children for this, that are earning a lot of profit, but not paying a lot of tax. France, about 5 years ago, seemed to get tired of that happening and imposed a digital services tax, which was viewed certainly by the US, and I don't think unfairly, as an anti-US measure, simply because all these global digital giants that weren't paying tax are US. So this is, I think, an interesting moment in lots of ways because you finally see some real daylight between the positions of the US and the European Union. The way the system has worked for a long time has been imperfect, but it's been imperfect in a way that does not really raise the ire of those who have their hands at the wheel. But now the US and the EU find themselves at loggerheads. And just maybe a week or two ago, the US actually pulled out of talks that were being held by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to address this issue. The US said, we're out. And part of that was related to the COVID crisis and how expensive that is for governments around the world. For the last century or so, international tax had been complicated and not that interesting to many people, interesting to me, but not everybody. But it had worked fairly well in most people's eyes. It is now viewed as not working very well. And a big part of why it's perceived to not be working well is because they're big profitable companies, Apple, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and they are just not paying tax anywhere. This is viewed as a problem, in a sense, specific to digital, but I see it as a bigger, more generalized problem that is just exemplified in the digital space. And what's really brought things to a head on the digital tax front, and the reason that France's digital services tax, adopted just not very many years ago to great controversy, has angered the United States. For most of the last century, even though there have been differences between the US and Europe, who are really the heart of the OECD, they've really been on the same side. So they've really been on the same side of the global economy. But now in the digital space, they're different. Europe are generally customers, and the US is, they are the companies. So this has been perceived, and I don't think incorrectly, as a little bit of a US EU battle. So with US being a champion of Apple and Facebook and Google, and France trying to grapple with the inability, apparent inability of the international tax regime to tax these companies. So things are at a stalemate. And if you look at the headlines, if you can move past the COVID headlines and the Black Lives Matter headlines, not that I'm saying you should do that, but if you do make it past those, you'll find that there's talk of a digital trade and tax war between the US and Europe. And this is what it's about.
So you've mentioned that these large corporations can end up avoiding the payment of tax anywhere. And I take it that that includes not only international tax, but also domestic tax right here at home. To what extent is that the case, that they're able to avoid even their national tax obligations here in the United States? And how does that play into the political issues of the day?
Well, it's interesting to note that there, for a long time, has been sort of a question posed by folks who are not tax people. Why is it that global companies manage to lower their tax rates very effectively, but those that are more squarely domestic, do pay corporate income tax? So the question was, is Walmart just not very aggressive? Why do they have a fairly high tax rate when more global companies don't? So, and the truth is, they just aren't able to play that classification assignment game. They aren't able to move income from one box to another across borders. So they end up paying sort of the tax that everyone in theory should pay. But at the domestic level, I mentioned a second ago that the most important tax for the US is not the corporate income tax. That is not where we get most of our revenue from. Most of our revenue comes from our personal income tax. So that's a separate structure. They're similar, they're related, but it's separate. And interestingly, there's a similar phenomenon that's been playing out domestically. And you saw this exemplified with the proposed wealth tax. So Elizabeth Warren's proposed wealth tax, and it's been noted that this is should be unnecessary because mathematically, wealth is income. If income is a stream, wealth is the pool. So if you can tax the stream effectively, you should be able to tax the pool. But we're just not very good at taxing that stream. And in the same way that the international tax rules make us think that Google is not doing very well when it actually is doing great, there's a similar phenomenon on the domestic side where the domestic income tax, the personal income tax, somehow thinks that Mark Zuckerberg is not doing very well, right? Which is patently absurd. But because we don't tax the appreciation on Zuckerberg's stock, he only has whatever income he earns on Facebook dividends, which I assume there are none. I haven't looked lately, but that would be surprising. Or any income he's generated from book royalties, as we know. Maybe his are bigger than ours, Michael. I would guess that they probably are. But you have a similar sort of tension happening on the domestic side with the system that's been in place for a long time that nominally taxes income, just not really reaching a really big chunk of it. The income earned by billionaires on their stock portfolio, on their stock in Facebook, if you're Zuckerberg, and so on, just isn't taxed. So you really have an inability of the system to deal with the digital space. whether it's digital tycoons in the US domestically or global digital giants. And for most of the last century, the global South has said, "Hey, don't we get some tax revenue?" And the response has been, "Just leave us alone. We're dealing with important stuff here. Don't bother us." But now, when the EU finds itself on the short end of the stick with Google and Amazon, and when the merely rich in the United States feel that they're being, lawyers and doctors are paying high tax rates, much higher than Zuckerberg and the other global titans, you get a different sort of political dynamic, which I think does suggest there may be more change. So, it did seem for about, 2019, that the 2020 election would just be a referendum on the wealth tax, or it seemed that way to me. Maybe my perspective was a little bit skewed, but it does not seem that that's going to be the case now. But that domestic tension, to me, parallels what you see on the global side. It's definitely interesting times for tax people. As I say, crises are expensive, and we seem to have a few pretty big ones happening simultaneously.
It's been an ongoing theme during this series to ask people about their own scholarly projects and work. What kinds of things are you up to right now, and how do they relate to some of these issues?
I've been writing with another professor at Brooklyn, Dana Brackman-Reeser, known as DBR to those who are fans. And we've got another book coming out in a year or two on for-profit philanthropy. And it sounds odd. It sounds almost like an oxymoron, and maybe we think it is, but we're not quite sure yet. It is really a sign of the collapse between the traditional divide between for-profit ventures and philanthropic ventures. So, this is, broadly speaking, it's corporations getting rid of their foundation. So GM used to have an in-house foundation. It would channel its philanthropy through that, but for reasons that we're trying to unravel, it did away with that. And now it just does its charity strategically within General Motors itself. Doesn't use a separate vehicle. When Mark Zuckerberg, I feel like I'm obsessed with Zuckerberg, when he created what a lot of people thought was a foundation a few years ago, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, that was not perceived correctly. Most people think it was a foundation like the Gates Foundation, but it was not. It was just a limited liability company. So it was just the kind of, I think of it as sort of a hedge fund for philanthropy. It just does whatever it wants. It's not subject to the same regulatory structure that a traditional old line bank would be in the way that a hedge fund can do anything it wants to make money. These new sort of philanthropic ventures, these LLCs, are omnivorous in the same kind of way. And this has lots of potential benefits, but it also has some potential drawbacks. And I'm looking forward to really getting back into working with Dana again to try to get to the bottom of that and understand what's happening.
We certainly look forward to seeing this new scholarly work as it comes out. Thanks so much for this conversation and for sharing your thoughts and expertise with us. Thanks to everyone for watching. We look forward to seeing you again for another episode in our series on law in time of crisis.
Well, thank you very much, Michael, for having me. And thanks everybody for watching. I look forward to reconnecting with Brooklyn Law School next year.